October 25, 1944. 0820 hours, 200 meters east of Cape Engaño, northern Philippines. Vice Admiral Jisuro Ozawa, aboard the carrier Zuikaku, watched as his last operational air group prepared for launch. 75 aircraft would strike Task Force 38, supported by its screens of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Mark 37 fire control directors were already tracking, and VT proximity fuses were loaded. What followed would decisively destroy the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation. Lieutenant Commander Masaki Shamakawa gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M50 as the deck crew removed the wheel chocks. The flight deck pitched with moderate seas, but that was minor compared to the looming danger. The Northern Force included hybrid battleships ISE and Hyuga, 2 light cruisers, and around 8 destroyers. But everyone, from Admiral Ozawa down, understood the harsh truth: they were bait. Their mission was to lure Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf, allowing Admiral Toko Kurita's Center Force to strike the American invasion fleet. The cost of this deception would be measured in ships and lives, mostly their own. Shamakawa had survived since 1942, witnessing early victories at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean. He had also endured the massacre at the Philippine Sea 4 months prior, what the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of fellow aviators had died in a single day, most never even reaching their targets. The Americans had fundamentally changed naval warfare. Their ships no longer simply defended themselves, they projected deadly fire into the sky at seemingly impossible ranges. At 0600, the Zuikaku's air officer, Commander Toshio, briefed the pilots. The American task force had been located to the south and was advancing. Task Force 38 was the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. 15 carriers, 6 battleships, 14 cruisers, and over 50 destroyers. But it was not the numbers that troubled Shamakawa, it was what those ships carried. Dual-purpose 5-inch 38 caliber guns could engage targets far beyond visual range. Ships bristled with 40 mm Bofors quad mounts and 20 mm Oerlikon cannons. Hidden in magazines were the proximity-fused shells that exploded near, rather than on, their targets, sending lethal fragments into the sky. The first wave would consist of roughly 75 aircraft from all 4 Northern Force carriers. Shamakawa would lead 12 Zeros from Zuikaku, tasked with suppressing the American combat air patrol long enough for the strike aircraft to reach their targets. It was a fantasy everyone knew would fail. The Americans would field over 200 F-6F Hellcats, guided by radar fighter direction that could vector them onto targets beyond the horizon. The Japanese had no comparable guidance, no proximity fuses, no integrated defense, just courage. At 0844, Shamakawa's Zero roared down Zuikaku's flight deck and into the morning sky. Behind him, the strike force slowly formed, struggling with fuel and engine issues that plagued hastily maintained aircraft. Many pilots had less than 100 flight hours. The veterans who could have led them were dead, scattered across the Pacific from Midway to the Marianas. As they turned south, Shamakawa noticed aircraft trailing smoke. Some would never reach the target. Aboard the battleship USS Iowa, Fire Controlman First Class Robert Carlson observed the Mark 37 director track the incoming raid on radar. The Iowa's main battery of 16-inch 50 caliber Mark 7 guns could fire 2,700-pound shells over 20 miles, but today, they would remain silent. This was a job for the dual-purpose 5-inch 38 caliber guns in 10 twin mounts, capable of rapid fire at high altitude. These shells used the VT proximity fuse, the secret weapon transforming naval anti-aircraft warfare. Carlson had been at his station since 0600, when radar first detected the enemy. The Mark 37 director tracked targets in 3 dimensions, compensating for the ship's movement while calculating speed, altitude, and bearing. The Mark 1A fire control computer processed this data, sending firing solutions to the guns. The VT fuse detonated automatically near aircraft, creating a lethal sphere of fragments roughly 100 feet across. Previously, hundreds of rounds were required to down a single attacker. VT fuses reduced that number dramatically. By 0958, Iowa's radar detected the incoming strike. The task force was at general quarters, every gun manned, damage control parties ready. The carriers launched their combat air patrol, over 200 F-6F Hellcats, vectored by fighter direction officers using SK-series air search radars. The Japanese strike force would have to fight through these interceptors before facing the combined firepower of the fleet. It was not a battle, it was an execution. Shimakawa saw the first dark blue specks of Hellcats above, at 25,000 feet. The Americans had the altitude advantage and were already diving. The F-6F Hellcat was heavily armored with self-sealing fuel tanks and powered by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine. It could sustain tremendous damage and remain operational. The Zero, optimized for maneuverability and range, lacked armor and self-sealing tanks, powered by just 1,130 horsepower. In 1941, these design choices granted Japan air superiority. By 1944, they were death sentences. The first Hellcat pass destroyed 8 Japanese aircraft. Shimakawa watched a Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber disintegrate under concentrated fire. Another Zero attempted to evade but was set ablaze, spiraling into the ocean. The American pilots, methodical and professional, used altitude and speed for slashing attacks. Shimakawa fired a single burst at a passing Hellcat, only to see his rounds glance harmlessly off its armor. The enemy continued its dive toward a Yokosuka D-4Y below, which exploded moments later. Japanese aircraft died from single hits. American aircraft absorbed dozens of rounds and remained airborne. By the time surviving Japanese aircraft reached visual range of Task Force 38, only 40 remained. They had endured mechanical failures, fuel exhaustion, and constant attacks, now facing the fleet's massive anti-aircraft defense. Miles ahead, Shimakawa saw the task force stretch across the horizon. Carriers at the center, concentric rings of escorts around them. Black smoke puffs began appearing as the 5-inch guns opened fire. VT-fused shells detonated invisibly, forming lethal spheres. Zeros vanished in clouds of aluminum fragments and fireballs. Aboard USS San Diego, Commander William Harrison watched the Japanese formation. His ship's 12 5-inch guns, plus 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons, engaged continuously. The Bofors, designed in Sweden and manufactured under license in the U.S., fired 2-pound shells at a high rate, maintaining almost continuous fire. By late 1944, they accounted for a large portion of medium-range kills. Harrison observed a Japanese dive bomber attacking the carrier USS Essex. Descending from 15,000 feet into a 70° dive, the pilot faced concentrated fire from every ship in range. The 5-inch guns fired continuously, with VT fuses detonating around the aircraft. At 8,000 feet, 40mm Bofors added their distinct pom-pom fire. At 3,000 feet, 20mm Oerlikons joined in. By 2,000 feet, the bomber was destroyed, either by direct hits or cumulative proximity detonation. The bomb never dropped. The pilot's sacrifice was meaningless against layered American defenses. This pattern repeated across the fleet. Surviving Japanese aircraft faced overlapping fire from multiple ships, never allowing a pause. Shimakawa led 6 remaining Zeros toward USS Massachusetts, aiming to suppress anti-aircraft fire for torpedo bombers. The South Dakota-class battleship mounted 91 16-inch guns, but its secondary 5-inch 38 caliber radar-directed guns, dozens of 40 mm Bofors, and scores of 20 mm Oerlikons were the real threat. Massachusetts was not a ship, it was a floating fortress. As Shimokawa approached, the 5-inch guns elevated and trained in perfect unison, 10 mounts moving as one. The Mark 37 fire control system worked flawlessly, radar tracking, computers calculating, guns firing instantly. The first salvo exploded ahead of his formation. Shimoka rolled sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding fragments striking his aircraft's thin aluminum skin. 2 Zeros behind him were not so lucky, both hit by multiple fragments through engines and fuel tanks. The American fire control system was unlike anything the Japanese had faced. The Type 94 relied on optical sighting and manual calculations. Gunners estimated range, speed, and altitude by eye and set fuses by hand. It was sufficient against slow targets in good visibility, but fell short against fast aircraft in combat. The Americans had automated the process. Radar provided exact range and bearing. Computers calculated firing solutions, and power drives aimed the guns. A single director could control multiple mounts, concentrating fire with deadly precision. Shimoka pressed his attack, diving toward the Massachusetts's superstructure. With his two 20 mm cannons firing, tracers disappeared into the wall of return fire. 40 mm shells exploded around his plane, each creating a deadly sphere of fragments. 20 mm rounds rained horizontally across the air. At 800 meters, Shimoka pulled up sharply, his Zero groaning under G-forces. Below, a torpedo bomber tried to line up for a drop, but lasted only seconds before being destroyed by concentrated 40 mm fire. On Mount 52 of the Massachusetts, a chief gunner's mate commanded a 105 mm/38 dual-purpose mount. His crew of 15 maintained a high rate of fire, 30 rounds per minute. Each shell weighed about 55 pounds, with a muzzle velocity of roughly 2,600 feet per second. At maximum elevation of 85 degrees, they could reach high-flying targets. The mount's lethality came not from rate of fire or range but from integration with the fire control system and proximity fuses. Mount 52 targeted a Japanese dive bomber at long range, fed data directly from the Mark 37 director. The crew didn't need to see the target or calculate lead. The computer handled everything, automatically training the mount. Shells, loaded with proximity fuses, detonated at optimal distances. Often, gunners didn't even know if they destroyed an aircraft. This new technology defined naval warfare, replacing manual estimation with systems that multiplied weapon effectiveness. The Japanese strike was falling apart. Of the aircraft that reached the American fleet, only a fraction remained. Survivors, mostly Zeros and a few dive bombers, scattered and made attacks with little chance of success. They faced not just single ships but overlapping fields of fire. A pilot attacking one vessel would be under fire from several, all directed by radar tracking him through maneuvers. Lieutenant Saburo Hidajima, piloting one of the last torpedo bombers, approached the USS Langley, an Independence-class light carrier. Smaller than fleet carriers but heavily armed, the Langley had 40 mm buffers and 20 mm cannons. Flying at wave-top height, Hidajima hoped to evade radar and reduce exposure to anti-aircraft fire, a tactic from 1942, now obsolete against 1944's layered defenses. Tall water splashes ahead signaled he'd been spotted. 5-inch shells fused to detonate at sea level. Pulling up slightly, he entered a stream of 40 mm fire from a destroyer on the carrier's port quarter. Rounds tore through his plane, one exploded in the torpedo bay. The Type 91 torpedo detonated, destroying the aircraft instantly. Hidajima and his crew died without realizing what hit them. A destroyer squadron commander observed the Japanese strike from his Fletcher-class flagship. His destroyers formed the outer screen of Task Force 38, the first defensive line. Each carried 5-inch/38 guns, 40 mm Bofors, and 20 mm Oerlikons, plus the latest SG surface and air search radars linked to Mark 37 fire control. Doctrine emphasized coordinated fire and mutual support. Divisions could create overlapping fields of fire no aircraft could penetrate. Radar and proximity-fused shells disrupted incoming formations before they reached attack positions. Individual aircraft that slipped through faced medium-range 40 mm guns, then close-range 20 mm fire, a layered defense leaving attackers no respite. The Japanese strike was destroyed so thoroughly that many American sailors never saw an enemy up close. On USS Hazelwood, a radarman tracked the engagement on his scope. Japanese aircraft appeared as blips, steadily disappearing as Hellcats and anti-aircraft fire eliminated them. To him, it was not a battle but a mathematical exercise, geometry and technology producing inevitable results. Lieutenant Commander Shimaka survived, returning to his carrier with a damaged Zero. Multiple 20 mm hits had damaged the engine and hydraulics, and fuel leaked from punctured tanks. Approaching Zuikaku, he saw American aircraft attacking. The roles had reversed. Over 500 planes of Task Force 38 struck the northern force. Waves of fighters suppressed anti-aircraft fire while dive and torpedo bombers attacked from multiple directions. The Japanese lacked proximity fuses, integrated fire control, and comparable radar. Their 25 mm Type 96 guns required manual aiming, making consistent hits against 300 mph aircraft nearly impossible. Shimaka watched from his damaged Zero as SB-2C Helldivers pounded the carrier. Diving from 15,000 feet, bombs struck amid scattered anti-aircraft fire. Japanese gunners fired frantically but could not track the high-speed targets. Within minutes, explosions tore down the flight deck. The technological gap extended beyond weapons to the entire approach to naval warfare. The Americans had integrated radar, communications, and fire control into systems multiplying weapon effectiveness. Japanese defenders relied on skill and courage, which mattered little against proximity-fused shells guided by radar. Admiral Ozawa watched from Zuikaku's bridge as his fleet was destroyed. Chiyoda went down early, Chiyoda would follow, and the light carrier Zuikaku burned. American fighters strafed anti-aircraft positions, dive bombers targeted the deck, and torpedo bombers hit the hull. Survivors abandoned ship as fires raged. The last aircraft, including Shimaka's damaged Zero, were pushed overboard to prevent shifts during the list. By 1414, Zuikaku sank, taking hundreds with her. Ozawa transferred to the light cruiser Ioto and ordered remaining ships to scatter north. The northern force had lured Task Force 38 away from Leyte Gulf but at a devastating cost, the effective end of Japanese carrier aviation. Over 100 aircraft were destroyed, many trained pilots lost, and remaining carriers heavily damaged. American naval technology and integrated tactics had decisively ended Japan's carrier threat. Losses in the attack on the northern force were relatively light, and most downed pilots were rescued. The battle off Cape Engaño highlighted a fundamental shift in naval warfare. The combination of radar, fire control computers, and proximity fuses made traditional air attacks against a fast-moving carrier task force nearly suicidal. The Americans had built a defensive system that engaged enemy aircraft at long range, guided by fighters, reinforced with multiple layers of anti-aircraft fire, and left attackers little chance to reach their targets. The Japanese, relying on early war technology and tactics, were not only defeated, they were systematically destroyed. Commander Mazit Kumiya, a staff officer who survived, later recalled the shock of confronting American firepower. Japan had planned for losses, but the complete inability to cause meaningful damage shattered morale. Pilots who had been told they were superior discovered that bravery alone could not overcome technology. The proximity fuse, never fielded by Japan, turned near misses into kills. Radar guidance meant American guns were already tracking targets well beyond visual range. The human cost was immense. In addition to those lost with Zuikaku, the Chitose and Chiyoda carriers suffered near-total losses of their crews, and Zuho lost many more. Hundreds also perished on destroyers and cruisers that were sunk or damaged. But it was the loss of trained carrier aircrews that marked the true end. These were among the last skilled pilots in the Imperial Navy. Any replacements would have had as little as 50 flight hours, facing American pilots with hundreds of combat hours in superior aircraft backed by highly advanced naval defense systems. The technological gap widened as the war progressed. Americans improved proximity fuses for reliability and sensitivity. Fire control radars tracked targets at longer ranges. The Japanese had no answer. Their industrial capacity was collapsing, technical expertise exhausted, and their best minds were diverted to projects that could not change the war's outcome. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the center force intended to support Ozawa, later expressed dismay at learning of the Northern forces' destruction. Tactically, the plan had succeeded in drawing American forces north, but strategically, the losses were catastrophic. Without carrier aviation, the Imperial Navy was reduced to a coastal defense force. Surface ships without air cover were merely targets, as Kurita witnessed when American aircraft sank the super battleship Musashi despite its heavy anti-aircraft defenses. Lieutenant Commander Shamakawa, who evacuated from Zuikaku before it sank, spent the rest of the war training kamikaze pilots. This was a tacit admission of defeat, acknowledging that conventional attacks against American naval forces were no longer feasible. The technological superiority was so complete that the only remaining option was to use aircraft as guided missiles, trading lives for the slim chance of inflicting damage. Even this approach ultimately failed. By Okinawa, proximity fuses and fire control systems had been further refined, combat air patrol strengthened, and ships that might have been overwhelmed by mass attacks in 1944 were shooting down most attackers by 1945. The destroyer USS Laffey survived multiple kamikaze hits and bomb strikes, with her crew fighting fires while continuing to engage targets, a clear example of the technological gap. The development of proximity fuses required unprecedented miniaturization and electronics. Tiny vacuum tubes had to survive being fired from guns at thousands of feet per second, spinning at high RPM, and function reliably after months in varying climates. The Japanese knew Americans had developed something new but never fielded an equivalent. Radar fire control systems were equally revolutionary. The Mark 37 Director used early analog computers to process multiple variables simultaneously: target bearing, range, altitude, speed, direction, and the ship's own motion, producing continuously updated firing solutions. Guns followed automatically, while crews simply loaded and fired. This automation allowed American ships to engage multiple targets efficiently, shifting fire as threats were neutralized or new ones appeared. The Bofors 40mm gun was another leap. Though Swedish in design, American mass production and integration made it decisive. Japanese 25mm Type 96 guns were inferior, limited by short magazines, slower rates of fire, and poor mounting stability. By late 1944, American cruisers and battleships carried medium and light anti-aircraft firepower far exceeding most Japanese heavy units. Post-war analysis confirmed Japan's technological inferiority. Differences across hundreds of ships and thousands of guns created overwhelming firepower that decimated Japanese air power. Training amplified this advantage. American gunners practiced on devices simulating combat, learning to operate complex equipment under stress, maintain delicate electronics, and work as integrated teams. Japanese gunners often trained in ideal conditions, each crew operating independently. In combat, Americans performed with precision, while Japanese crews struggled with inadequate equipment and outdated tactics. Fire Controlman First Class Robert Carlson, tracking incoming Japanese strikes aboard USS Iowa, recalled the impersonal nature of the battle. Japanese pilots appeared as radar blips, mathematical problems to be solved. The Mark 37 director computed the solution, the guns fired, and the blips vanished. This was the new reality of naval warfare, technology reducing human drama to data and calculations. The shock at Cape Engaño went beyond immediate losses. Japanese naval doctrine centered on decisive battles, single engagements that would determine the war. They trained, planned, and sacrificed to create these opportunities. But the Americans operated on fundamentally different principles, seeking systematic destruction through technological superiority rather than a single clash. The last months of the war saw increasingly desperate Japanese attempts to overcome American technology with human will. Kamikaze attacks, Oka flying bombs, and Cape-man torpedoes, all representing the same misunderstanding. Courage alone could not defeat technology. Proximity fuses, radar directors, and Bofors guns destroyed aircraft regardless of pilot bravery. Admiral Somu Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, later testified that by 1944 the Japanese Navy had been technically defeated. Ships still sailed, aircraft still flew, but effective combat against American forces was impossible. The battle off Cape Engaño demonstrated this with brutal clarity. Japanese carriers and aircraft accomplished little beyond temporarily diverting American attention. Their sacrifice only delayed the inevitable. The Northern Forces' destruction marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation, symbolizing the triumph of systems over individuals, integration over isolation, and technology over tradition. The Americans had not simply built better weapons. They had revolutionized naval warfare by creating interconnected systems, multiplying the effectiveness of each component. Post-war, Japanese naval officers studied American technology with awe. How did Americans develop proximity fuses that survived gunfire? How did they miniaturize radar for aircraft and small ships? How did they mass-produce complex fire control computers? The answers lay in systematic application of science, industry, and operational experience. The Americans had not merely fought a war, they had transformed warfare itself. Lieutenant Commander Shimakawa, who survived Task Force 38's strike and the sinking of Zuikaku, spent years explaining the experience to younger generations. He described the shock of watching aircraft vanish in midair, explosions occurring yards away, and American guns tracking targets with inhuman precision while Japanese gunners struggled. The technological gap was so vast it felt like fighting an enemy from the future. The battle off Cape Engaño was a watershed moment, the death of traditional naval aviation, replaced by technology-driven warfare. Japan lost 4 carriers and, more importantly, the ability to contest American control of the Pacific. Proximity fuses, radar fire control, and integrated defense systems created a barrier no courage could penetrate. The wall of steel, faced by Shimakawa and his fellow pilots, was not merely defensive, it represented the future of naval combat, a future with no place for the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the aftermath, Admiral Halsey, criticized for leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded, made a decision still debated today. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation ended any hope of offensive action at sea. Without carriers, trained pilots, or air superiority, Japan's navy was finished as a fighting force. The 4 carriers sacrificed by Ozawa were the last symbol that Japan could fight the United States on equal terms. On the night of October 25, 1944, the surviving Northern Force ships fled north, harassed by American aircraft until darkness provided cover. Oil slicks and debris marked the graves of 4 carriers and thousands of sailors. Ozawa had achieved his tactical objective, but at the cost of everything. The VT proximity fuse, tightly guarded through 1944 and 1945, had transformed naval and land warfare, making artillery devastatingly effective. Japan never produced an equivalent. The wall of steel that destroyed the Northern Forces' airstrike represented a lasting transformation in naval warfare. Ships became increasingly resistant to conventional air attack. Integration of sensors, computers, and weapons accelerated, enabling accurate engagement beyond visual range. The battle off Cape Engaño was not just a defeat, it marked the end of an era when technology decisively surpassed tradition. For the men who attacked Task Force 38, there was admiration for their courage and pity for their sacrifice. They were asked to overcome with spirit what could only be countered with technology. Shamakawa and the few survivors carried the memory of this impossible mission for life. The sight of aircraft disappearing in smoke, explosions without hits, and an enemy operating beyond traditional limits. The ocean off Cape Engaño holds the wreckage of 4 carriers and hundreds of aircraft, not just steel and aluminum, but the point where naval warfare changed forever, where systems replaced heroes and technology became supreme.